Right, aesthetics and jugs and rock and roll. A somewhat laboured pun, we shall see. Well, here are the jugs. The jugs are on my shelf in my kitchen at home down in Somerset. And I want to look just particularly at these two this afternoon. They're both contemporary British studio pottery. Neither of them is anything terribly special, not worth a fortune or anything like that. So there's no catch to the question that I'm going to ask you in a moment. Let's take them outside and have a better look at them. I've called one of them L and one of them B. And since we're all into behavioral economics and you know about order effects, let's turn them around so that you can see there's B and there's L. Now here's a quick question. I want you to answer it very quickly. If I said to you, you can have one of these jugs, but only one of these jugs, which one would you choose to take? Can I have a show of hands first of all for jug B? And now for jug L? That's interesting. You had little difficulty making a choice. I would think there is a slight preference there for jug B, and that is certainly my personal preference. Jug L is made by John Leach down in Muchelney. I think it's a very nice jug. I wouldn't have bought it otherwise. Jug B is made by a potter called Sven Beyer, who works down in darkest Devonshire. And that, for me, is a much more special jug. I think it's a beautiful jug. It's the one I would certainly take if I could only keep one of them. And I have no difficulty making that choice. And yet, on the face of it, it's not easy to say why I find it so easy to make that choice. Because those two jugs, in most ways, they're very, very similar. They're made out of similar material, they're similar colour, they're similar size. If you had to describe them to somebody who couldn't see them, it would be very hard to explain why one of these affected you differently from the other. Now, I want to suggest to you that this simple choice between two simple jugs may stand for a very important dimension of consumer choice between brands, between designs, between adverts or whatever. And I want to suggest further that perhaps the principal dimension of that choice is something that we could call aesthetics. That's what it's about. Now, what do I mean by aesthetics? One simple definition I found is this. It comes from Ken Wilber, who says, at the time of the Enlightenment, back in the 18th century, we made a big separation between three different sets of values that became very separate in our minds. There's the moral values. Is it right? There's instrumental values. Does it work? Is it efficient? And then there are the aesthetic values. Very simply, is it beautiful? Now, there may be more to it than just beauty, but I'll use that as a shorthand for now. It's my impression, from my experience, that within the world of organizations, the dominant scheme of values is very, very strongly instrumental values. It's about efficiency, does things work? Aesthetic, on the other hand, is a word that we really don't hear used very much at all. And frankly, it's a word that comes trailing rather a lot of baggage that probably doesn't play too well in corporate HQ. It's a little bit fluffy, shall we say, a little bit limp-wristed somehow, and it doesn't have that high seriousness that we tend to want in the business context. There is another word that we do hear rather a lot more, although it's still slightly on the edge, and that word is creativity. I think to some extent the word creativity stands for aesthetics in a lot of the discourses that we hear. And yet, in order to get itself into corporate HQ, it seems to me that the word creativity has come to mean a number of things that are quite unlike what I mean when I talk about aesthetics. Now, I've read quite a lot of stuff about creativity over the last few years. I've read academic literature about the subject, I've read management literature about the subject, and of course I've been very exposed to what people in the creative industry of advertising have to say about the subject. And I'm struck in all cases by two things which I'd like to point out to you. The first is that creativity is nearly always linked very closely or even equated with originality or innovation. It's about novelty, about doing something new. Secondly, it is very often conceived of as being something to do with having new ideas or talking about the product being the creative idea. Now, I'll just give you a couple of examples of that, and I promise you I could find a lot more. Let's look first of all at what some academics have to say. There's a massive book by Sternberg and Lubart called the Handbook of Creativity, which is full of stuff like this, and they start off by defining creativity as the ability to produce work that is novel, original, unexpected, while at the same time being appropriate, they go on to add. So that's part of the academic discourse. If we look at something like the Royal Society of Arts report that they did a couple of years ago into creativity in organisations, they start off by saying creativity and innovation, words that we use synonymously. These are exactly the same thing. And as you read on, it's very clear that when they're talking about creativity, they actually mean developing and managing new ideas. If you do a Google search for images, as one does when putting these sort of presentations together, you'll find very quickly that perhaps the commonest sort of image that's for creativity is this, the light bulb going on or some variation on it. It's the bright idea. And when you read about creativity in the trade press, there's a recent interesting article from Campaign, how advertising's big ideas are born. It's books like this by the famous copywriter Jim Young, A Technique for Producing Ideas. This is the kind of discourse that surrounds creativity in its business context. Now, you may be so familiar with all this that it seems absolutely right and natural to you, and that you're wondering what I'm kind of making a fuss about. Well, the more I look at it, the more it seems very strange to me. It seems strange not just to me as an individual who has my own interest in what I think of as creative activities, but perhaps more importantly, I think it's a strange way of thinking of creativity from the point of view of what it should be contributing in a business context. And I think I can make my point simply by just going back to my two jugs. First of all, if creativity is, I'd like to say that B, for me, that is the jug that exhibits more creativity than L. And yet, there's nothing original or innovative about either of those jugs. They're actually both working in very, very traditional styles. And in fact, either of them could probably be made 100 or even 200 years ago. So whatever's going on here, what I'm talking about, the aesthetic value, is nothing to do with originality or innovation. Neither can I see any sense at all in talking about the importance of the creative idea here. I don't know if you can, but, the creative idea is, I thought I'd make a jug, and I'd pour stuff out of it, which doesn't really tell us anything to the purpose at all. So these seem to me sort of strange definitions. Even when you pick an artwork, and I'm trying to move beyond jugs here and generalize a bit more because I don't think they're a special case. Let's choose an artwork that is very original. Here's Gary's famous museum. And, you can say, yes, that's original. But then it leads you to say, is it good because it's original? Or does it just happen to be original and good and beautiful? And I don't think originality is a necessary component of aesthetic quality. What, again, is the creative idea behind Gary's museum? Let's make some funny shapes and cover them in metal. What does that say? What's the creative idea behind that picture? What is the creative idea behind that picture? What's the creative idea behind Schubert's unfinished symphony? I think if I make the point in these contexts, perhaps it's very clear. And yet we don't need to restrict ourselves to the field of high art. Let's go to popular culture, which is getting us a lot closer back towards brands and advertising after all. And let's look at something like, an early recording of Elvis Presley. This is where the rock and roll comes in. Now, there's actually very little that's original or innovative about this. Musically, it's the same three chords that every rock and roll or blues song has used since the dawn of time. The melody is not original, the rhythm is not original, but it's a great performance. And to explain why, we have to look for other language. We have to try and use words like presence or energy or timing or nuance or whatever. We can talk a lot about it, but it's certainly, I think, not much to do with the idea or the originality of it. Now, I want to make my point that it is this aesthetic quality that I'm talking about that is strongly implicated in consumer choice. We've heard a lot today about how consumer choice is largely unconscious, it's emotionally based, it is affective, it's holistic, it's intuitive. Various speakers have made those points, so I don't need to make them now. But for me, that kind of choice is therefore strongly influenced by what I'm calling aesthetics. We're probably familiar, and if not, I invite you to become familiar with the work of Paul Václavic and his definition of analog communication rather than digital communication. Analog being about nuance, gesture, context, about all the unverbal things that can't be put into words that are motivating about communication and that create relationships. So I think we need to reclaim this word creativity. We need to redefine it. We need to move it away from these narrow ideas that have somehow hijacked it, about it being to do with originality, to do with innovation, or to do with abstract ideas. And we need to relocate it in the world of aesthetics. We need to relocate it in the world of tangible objects, sounds, whatever senses we're talking about, but it's in the nuance, in the detail, in the pattern behind those that it makes the difference. I'm sure that this is what Bill Bernbach, the great ad man, had in mind when he said this: is creativity some obscure esoteric art form? Not in your life, it's the most practical thing a businessman can employ. He illustrated that by taking this very famous ad from the 1920s, and he said, how would it have been if they had just put that headline instead? They admired my piano playing. It would have had the same meaning, he says, but actually, would it have had the same effect? I don't think so, and I think it's self-evident that it wouldn't. This is what he said: the difference is artistry, the intangible thing that business distrusts. And if we distrust the word aesthetics, then perhaps we should at least try and use words like artistry a little more, or try to be aware that that's what we're talking about when we're talking about creativity. Thank you very much.